So the second day of Rosetta Fest 2026 is going to be really centered on the whole idea of fiduciary liability and fiduciary risk. I think it's a very clear indicator that this is probably the topic of this year of 26, probably carry over into 27. It's the big focus right now. So today I want to look more closely at why this is drawing so much attention and give a little bit of history about where this thing came from, what the whole purpose behind it is, and what the benefits of it are. So the attention to fiduciary responsibility and ERISA, it might be new or increased, but the responsibility isn't. It's been there since 1974. Now, let me just give you a history of ERISA because it's interesting what has gone on. So back in the 50s and 60s, again, when you had retirement plan money in particular, and health and welfare money also, back then, nobody controlled how you use that money. Nobody controlled if the money was there or not. So there were a lot of really tragic situations, I would say, that arose because of the fact that there weren't rules around this stuff. One that came along was in 1964, 1965, the Studebaker Corporation, which was an automobile manufacturer for the younger people who may not remember Studebakers, but they were an automobile manufacturer based in South Bend, Indiana. They were in business for many years, like 30, 35 years. They had auto workers that worked in that plant for 30 or 35 years. The company went bankrupt. And when the company went bankrupt, these people thought they were going to get a pension plan. And it turns out that the company had spent all of the pension money and there was no pension money to have. So these people who had worked there for 35 years thinking they were going to get a pension plan, zippo, nothing. They didn't get anything. So that was one thing. It's a second thing, we're using money in ways that were questionable, or you could say a lot of things about what they were doing. But one of the really classics was the fact that the early days of Las Vegas was originally paid for with pension money from Teamsters pension plans. And I'm not trying to pick on the Teamsters, okay, but Teamster pension money that built those early days casinos in Las Vegas. So if you go down to downtown Las Vegas today and you see those old time casinos, those were all built with pension money from the Teamsters. But then the one that got really the big attention was the United Mine Workers. So we've got the United Mine Workers, and these are the people who cover coal miners. People who are going to go down in the hole, work in the coal mines all day long, okay, do it for 20, 30 years, get black lung disease, all the bad things that went along with being coal miners, okay? Well, it turns out that they owned a bank. They owned the Bank of Washington. And so the United Mine Workers owned a bank. Well, all of the people that were on the board of directors of the Bank of Washington were the United Mine Workers officials, and they were all getting paid directors' fees, and directors' fees can be pretty generous. So they're all getting paid directors' fees for being there, and they're all doing sweetheart deals with themselves, like lending money for 1% interest or 0.5% interest to themselves for their own business interest or investment interest or whatever they were trying to do. But it got really crazy when there was a dissident within the United Mine Workers Union by the name of Jack Blonsky, and he was running against the president of the United Mine Workers Union, and he got assassinated. He and his wife and daughter all got killed, okay? Now, just to put at the end of the story, the president of the United Mine Workers Union, Tony Boyle, then died in prison, okay, as a result of his life sentence of the murder of these people. So there were 9 people sentenced to prison over this killing. So it was kind of like a hit, okay? But this was all going on over the control of the United Mine Workers Pension Fund and Health and Welfare Plan money. And when the Congress got a hold of that one, that kind of set it off to this. That all occurred in the 60s, and that one just pushed it over the edge. So I'd say between Studebaker and the mine workers, that was through the two things that pushed them over the edge to put in this plan. So that's how we got there. It was a lot of corruption in using pension plan and health and welfare fund money. Lots of corruption, okay? So again, if we go back to the United Mine Workers Union, they put all of the pension money into this bank. They never even looked at an alternative, okay? And so at some point in time, there was a court proceeding over the fact that they did this. The courts just came back and said there wasn't even a glance at an alternative. This is where they went. It all went there. And again, so think about, again, we have a murder for hire and everything else going on around it. But think about the people who spent 20, 30, 40 years going every day into a mine and working in those conditions that they worked under in the 30s and the 40s and 50s and 60s, okay? And the the black lung disease and the various diseases that they got from it, the disabilities that arose from it, the mines that collapsed and people got killed. Okay. And there was very little health and welfare money and pension money left because the people who were running the fund were lining their own pockets. And that just sent Congress over the edge. So that's kind of the history of where this whole thing comes from. So abuses like this and other abuses were happening all over the place with employers. I mean, there's all kinds of shenanigans happening with retirement plan money and to a lesser degree with health and welfare money. It all became a problem. If we go back into the 70s, the first thing that happened was there was a lot of litigation and investigations and so forth against union plans because there was kind of common in the union health and welfare plans and the union pension plans that they seemed to be more susceptible to this kind of activity. So the original activity was related to the unions. But then if we get into the early 80s, well, now all of a sudden there's some new things start to. So one of the things that came along was a thing called the MIWA. Okay. And the MIWA was a health and welfare fund, and it was set up multiple employer welfare arrangements, is what it's called. And basically what they did is they take a whole bunch of small employers and put them together as one big employer, and then they can buy their health plan for a lot less money than buying them if you're a very small employer. So that's the idea behind the MIWA. Okay. Well, the problem is that people would set up these plans without any real association of these companies. So I used to joke about it that when we had a MIWA, we had the Cleveland Auto Dealers Association. So they were franchised new car dealers. They had to be franchised new car dealers to be in the plan. That was it. We would have used car dealers or RV dealers and so forth wanted to be in the plan, we wouldn't allow them in the plan. It was simply those plans. But some plans that were out there that were maybe a little bit less picky, okay? So they might start out and say, we're going to have a Chamber of Commerce plan. If you have a company in this arrangement, then you could be in the Chamber of Commerce plan. So that's how it started. But then they'd say, but now you don't really have to be a member of the Chamber of Commerce. You could be an affiliate member. So we'll have affiliates of the Chamber of Commerce plan. And then they stretch it out a little bit further. They're going to have affiliates of affiliates. And I used to joke, I said, so it got to be that you had the local regional Transportation Authority was the plan, and then you expand it out to be, well, you give people that rode on the bus could be in the plan, and then you could stretch it out a little bit further and say, well, people who've seen the bus go by, they could be in the plan too. So it was that loose. The problem, okay, so now what would happen is that in a health and welfare plan, if you pay any attention to them, you go to the doctor and you get a bill for today. Well, that bill doesn't get created for a month or two. By the time the bill gets created, gets sent through the mail, gets to the person who's going to pay the claim, they process the claim, they go get the money to pay the claim, on and on and on. A couple of months pass by, okay? So in the first year of these MIWAs, they didn't have to have 12 months of claims funded. They only had to have 10 months of claims funded, because they had a 2-month lag. So they would come in and offer a discount. Then say, okay, well, we'll run this plan for you for 20% less than you can buy it any place else. And people that sign up for it. Well, in year 2, they needed 100% of it. They didn't need 80% of the money. They needed 100% of the money, which meant you got a 25% increase, because 100% of 80%, okay. So now they get a 25% increase. Or the alternative was you could go sell twice as much next year as you sold this year and take that lag money and fund the shortfall with the lag money. Well, you can only do that for so long, and eventually you can't outsell yourself. And when you can't outsell your problem, you're going to run out of money. And when you run out of money, then you can't pay claims. That's it. You can't pay the claim. And we saw these things happening all the time. And probably the one I thought was kind of the craziest one is that we had a hospital in a town that had a Chamber of Commerce plan, and they set this thing up, and I looked at it for them. It was our customer, but they set up the Chamber of Commerce in this town, set up the plan, and I looked at the plan for them. I said, this plan doesn't have enough money in it. Okay, I said, you don't want to go on this plan. It's underfunded. This can't afford to operate on this basis. No. We're going to support the city. We're going to support the Chamber of Commerce. So we're going to go into the plan. So they did go into the plan. And as I had just outlined, 2 years later, the plan went bankrupt. Okay. And what was sad for the hospital is that they not only had to pay the claims that the plan couldn't fund, but they were also on the receiving end. They had a whole bunch of employers out there who couldn't pay their claims. So the hospital got it. They kind kind of got stuck both ways. They got stuck as an employer, and they got stuck again as a receiver of the money. So we got into this MEWA thing in the 80s, and there was legislation passed to control the way MEWAs were run, and it gave the states some regulation over them and so forth. And that whole issue sort of died down. Now, during that time, when all the goofing around was going on, there are also people who went to jail over running those MEWAs and embezzling from the MEWA. So there was that too, all under ERISA, all part of health and welfare funds. We get up to the 2000s, and then it changed focus again, and they come back, and now they're looking at retirement plans. And retirement plans have a lot of assets. You hold them for a long time, so there's investments, and they're long-term investments. So what was going on with the retirement plans is that the company would hire a stockbroker to be their investment manager. So the CEO might have a friend that's a stockbroker. The stockbroker is the investment manager on this thing. Well, the stockbroker is essentially a commission salesman, and the more they sell, the more commission they make. So what was happening in this environment, and now on the retirement plan side, is they were turning the stocks over faster and faster, much faster than they should. And every time they churned the stock over, this was the days when if a stockbroker sold a stock, they got paid a commission for selling the stock. Well, if they took that same dollar and bought 4 stocks with it instead of 1 stock with it, they got 4 times the commission. And all of a sudden, somebody starts to look at this thing and say, hey, wait a minute. Instead of our assets growing because we're getting returns on our money, our assets are shrinking because we're paying out too much in commissions. And so in the early 2000s, a couple of big law firms got in on this, and they started digging into it, and they went after the retirement plans, and they went after the fees associated with the retirement plans. And there were a lot of people that got in a lot of trouble over these fees. They were saying, well, if you're a fiduciary, you have to be responsible, okay? It's a position of trust, and it's one of the highest levels of trust that you're supposed to have. You're supposed to act like a prudent person would act with somebody else's money, okay? And you treat their money like it's your money. And you're supposed to do this. Well, churning these stocks over and over and over again wasn't prudent. And a lot of people got in a lot of trouble. There was a lot of fines. There were people that had probably lost their licenses over it. As a result of that, the rules changed. And now you started to see in retirement plans investing in more things like mutual funds, and you saw the no-load mutual funds come along and all of those kinds of things. And you started to see companies having retirement plan committees and written investment policies and fee benchmarking. How does our fees look against other people? Okay. They started to have regular minutes, and they started to have meetings about the retirement plans. They started keeping minutes about it. They started comparing who they were using as an investment advisor every few years to see, should we continue to use this person? And they had much clearer arrangements and disclosures about what fees were being paid. Now, the disclosure requirement goes all the way back to 1974. There was nothing new about the disclosure requirement. They just hadn't been done, hadn't been enforced. So today, you don't see retirement plans being invested in individual stocks where they buy this stock for 3 months and then they sell it and go buy the next stock in 3 months and they go buy it. Now they have a set strategy. They have an investment strategy. Interesting because of all of the activity, negative activity in the unions when ERISA first came into play. Unions have been doing this the longest. They've been doing it back into the 80s and 90s. And they even have their own association that has gigantic meetings every year to talk to the union trustees about how to make this thing work. So because of the growth of the cost of the plans and so forth, now the lawyers have turned their sights on these health and welfare plans. And they're going after some very large companies. And they started doing it with PBMs and pharmacy benefit managers. And one of the first cases on this was a case against Johnson & Johnson. And what's interesting about that is that you've got a pharmaceutical company being sued for not knowing how the pharmacy benefit managers, the people who they actually use to pay their claims. So, I mean, it's really crazy. Now we're looking at health plans. We're looking at fees. We're looking at compensation. We're looking at disclosure. So the disclosure issue's always been there. You've always had to say what you're making. I remember in 1974, going to meetings when ERISA was first started and listening to people talk about them. And what was decided, what the acronym ERISA meant was everything rotten invented since Adam. Okay, because The people in the retirement plan business and the health plan business just hated this thing. Again, ERISA came in, and this is how ERISA works. ERISA came in and said a plan, a retirement plan or a health and welfare plan may not pay anybody for doing any service for it. That's what it says. Nobody can be paid for doing services on behalf of a health and welfare plan or retirement plan. Okay? Now, who's going to do the work now? So they then came in and said, except that we're going to have a category called parties in interest. And parties in interest are people who do work for health and welfare plans or pension. So as a TPA, we would be a party in interest to a health and welfare plan because we're being paid by them. You have parties in interest, and they'd say you can't pay a party in interest, but then they exempt it. They made it put in an exemption unless it's a reasonable amount of money. So if it's a reasonable amount of money, you can pay them. The way they started that interpretation was that meant commissions. So basically, if you were a broker and you were getting a commission, if the commission was reasonable, then you'd be okay. Or if the fee for a TPA was a reasonable fee, then you'd be okay. Now, where it got twisted is that originally you had a broker, you had a TPA, and you had a stop-loss policy insurer. Those were the three parties to a health and welfare plan. Okay, well, what went on is that, there was a commission paid to the broker, maybe some of the commission from the stop-loss policy. There was a fee paid to the TPA usually by the plan. The broker was paid by a commission. Well, then the stop-loss carriers said, well, geez, we could probably sell more to the people who really know how to do this stuff. We could probably sell them more if we compensated them more. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, broker or TPA, both, if you give us these many groups, we're going to give you an override on your commission. So maybe the commission was 10%, but if you give us X number of groups, we'll pay you another 5% on top of the 10. Well, the interpretation was always, well, that's an override. That's not a commission. We don't have to disclose that. As time went on, there were overrides and there were overrides on top of the overrides and overrides on top of the overrides on top of the overrides. And pretty soon, there's more money being paid over the top of the commission than the commission. And that number got maybe double, triple the size of the commission. Well, the interpretation was, well, we don't have to disclose that. Now they're coming back and look at this thing and saying, if you really read ERISA, it says you have to disclose everything you're getting, not just a little bit. You have to disclose everything you're getting. So now there's all this machinations that are going on out there trying to figure out, well, does everything really mean everything? Or can I get away with this not being part of everything or that not being part of everything? And the lawyers that are out there, they're all working on a contingency. They're waiting. They can collect some money, but they're going to get a big percentage. And they're like this. We're looking at that same situation all over again because there's so much lack of disclosure, lack of clarity in how people are paid. People who are serving these health and welfare plans are paid. And that's what we're going to spend the second day of the Rosetta Fest. That's what it's pretty much dedicated to, that topic, to that. Now, there's probably have listeners out there going, well, that's about as interesting as listening to paint dry. Okay, but if you're in the middle of it and it's going on around you, it's very interesting. If you're an employer, you better be interested. Because if you're not interested, this could cost you a lot of money and potentially jail terms. I believe that this whole emphasis on fiduciary risk is really a very good thing. I think it's very positive for employers and employees. You want the plan to work. You want the plan to cover the expenses that the employees have. You want employees to be able to get the care that they need to be healthy so that they can function when they're on the job, or their minds can function because they're not worried about their families being sick. That's what you want from a healthcare plan. And again, this whole fiduciary liability thing, I think, will help plans get back toward that track, back on the pathway of making the plan what it's supposed to be, and not this convoluted thing that we've gotten into.